Thank you. I'd like to begin my classes and lectures with prayer, so if you would you please join me? Holy God, the Hebrew and Christian scriptures proclaim that at the heart of you is your hesed, your steadfast love. And as the author John says, God is love, you are love, and Jesus is that love incarnate. The Spirit is the force that spreads that love throughout this world and humanity. Help us to understand this mystery, and whether, when you call us to love, as you are love, we are capable of doing so. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. God is love, says the author of 1 John chapter 4, verse 16b. God is love. And if you read in 1 John, there's an extensive section that elaborates on this. Hold on. 1 John 4, verses 7 and 12, 16 and 17, 19 and 21. Listen to this text. Dear friends, this is the author of these Johannine epistles. Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. There's the text. This is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. This is love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. Dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete. And then 16 through 17, and so we know and rely on the love God has for us. God is love. There it is again. Whoever lives in love lives in God and God in him. In this way, love is made complete among us. And then 19 to 21. We love because God first loved us. If anyone says, I love God, yet hates his brother, he is a liar. For everyone who does not love his brother, whom he has seen, cannot love God, whom he has not seen. And he has given us this command: whoever loves God must love his brother. Okay. So there what you find is what I would call a universal ethic for love of one's fellow beings. And love is the hallmark of God, according to the Johannine writer. You see again, assuming this is either the same author or the same tradition, the Gospel of John, chapter 13, verses 34 to 35. Where it says, this is Jesus speaking, a new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. So there the command to love comes from Jesus. So that love is the hallmark of Christ and thus of Christ's followers. Now this is picking up from Leviticus 19, the Holiness Code, particularly verse 18. But if you follow all of verses 9 through 17, you get quite a context for whom we're supposed to love and what that love looks like. Leviticus 19, verse 18. Says, do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against one of your people, but love your neighbor as yourself, for I am the Lord. And then if you go back to verse 7 and just follow it through, it says, verse 9 and following, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Why? So the poor and the alien may get them. Verse 11, do not steal, do not lie, do not deceive one another, do not bear false witness, do not defraud your neighbor or rob your neighbor, do not hold back the wages of a hired person overnight. And on it goes. Do not pervert justice. Do not do anything that endangers your neighbor's life. For I am the Lord, and keep these decrees. Okay. And this, of course, follows the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, verses 28 to 31, where we get the Great Commandment. Hold on. 28 to 31. Okay. The most important, somebody asked Jesus, of all the commandments, which is most important? And Jesus says the most important one, and here he gives the Jewish Shema, is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. So, in terms of Greek understandings of love in that era, you've probably heard of the 4 forms of love. You've got storge, philia, eros, and agape. Interestingly, storge is the love of parents for children, or love within a family, or love of one's country, or love of one's favorite sports team. So that is that form of love. Pay attention to this one. It's going to come up in just a little bit when we look at a man named Jonathan Haidt and his theories. But there's also philia and eros, and you can claim that these are also present in God. For example, our own Wendy Farley has a fabulous book on divine eros and passion. But then there's agape. And agape in the Christian tradition, for good or ill, has always been associated with God and God's love for us and the creatures, and what we should mimic. Agape is, for the Greeks, it was feelings that one had for one's children or one's spouse, meaning it was intimate. But it entails an unconditional love, or as Thomas Aquinas said, to will the good of the other. That form of love is what is lifted up. And so, sure enough, Karl Barth, Reformed theologian, the writer of the Church Dogmatics, which if you go up in that library, look on the shelf, Church Dogmatics cover this much space. But when it came time to summarize who God is, Karl Barth gave a sentence. The sentence was, God is the one who loves in freedom. Love is the hallmark of who this God is. Similarly, Dan Migliore, professor of systematic theology at Princeton Seminary, when he was attempting to tell his students what is the nature of God, he also gave one sentence: God is self-giving, suffering, victorious love. Or in another sentence, I'm not quite sure why Dan had 2 and couldn't figure it out, God is self-giving, other-affirming, community-forming love. Okay? So this love is the kind of love that is found with grace. It is a grace-filled love. And it is the love, for Dan Migliore, found between the 3 persons of the Trinity. This love in that perichoretic movement flows from one to the other 2 and back again. This readiness and willingness to suffer, if need be, for the sake of the other and to lift the other up. This is how Migliore and this Reformed tradition is imagining God and God's love. You can pick it up in the West, though, from another angle, from who might be called the rationalists or rational ethicists. So, for example, Immanuel Kant, for his ethical principle, he found problems with the utilitarianism popular in his day, which basically says we should attempt to maximize the good of the general populace, but oftentimes what people interpret as the general good is simply their self-interest projected out into a bunch of other people. And so Kant said we need something that is categorical, which is a rule for all times and places and all peoples. And so he suggested one. An absolute, unconditional requirement that must be obeyed in all circumstances and is justified as an end in itself. And he suggested this first possibility. Act only according to the maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In other words, only do an act, an ethical act, if you wish Everybody else would do it too in these circumstances. In other words, somebody else would do it to you. Right? It's basically, once again, the golden rule. So, you have this ethic of universal love and of loving regard for the other that moves through this Western tradition that we live in. Whether it's the philosophical tradition or in particular the Hebrew and Christian tradition. And so sure enough, at the turning point of the 19th into the 20th century, that wonderful Jewish philosopher and theologian Martin Buber, in his famous book, I Am Thou, said that we are to take our whole selves, our bodies, our minds, our souls, our spirits, and Jesus himself pointed this out. Take our whole self and be in encounter with the whole being of the other. So this I to thou, subject to subject, whole self to whole self relationship is what Buber believed was the goal of human existence and where we find our peace, our joy, and our own human wholeness. Right? That is in contrast to the I-it relationship, which is not necessarily good or bad, but when it becomes predominant, it means we spend most of our time objectifying the other. Seeing the other as pieces, analyzing, judging the other, or simply using the other for our own purposes. But it is the I-thou relationship which God has with us and which God asks us to have with God and with our fellow human beings and even our fellow creatures, Buber said. To live that way would be to live with an interpretive lens. What Wendy Farley in her book Tragic Vision and Divine Compassion calls an interpretive grid of compassion. It means that in terms of your stance in the world and how you approach others and the ethical grid you use, you see the other as your fellow subject in life, and you have empathy and compassion on these beings. This compassionate grid is also uplifted not only by these Western trajectories, but by the Eastern philosophies and religions themselves. For example, Buddhism. There is a poem called Training the Mind in 7 Points. It suggests that the heart of Buddhist teachings is unconditional love or compassion. And so this universal compassion, for example, is part of the Kadam tradition of Mahayana Buddhism. And this unconditional regard for the Buddha nature which is present in all others is the unflowering of our own Buddha nature in ourselves, unflowering, or in other words, awakening, enlightenment. Because the Buddha is the awakened one. And what helps you get to that universal compassion, which actually is our true nature and our destiny, is what Buddhists call Dharma. So the Dharma is the training in compassion, the deepening of our compassion, until it transforms into a mind of great compassion, cherishing living beings and wishing to protect all living beings without exception from their suffering. We awaken this compassionate Buddha nature and complete it and become a Buddha or an awake one. What this brings is mental freedom and lasting happiness or joy. You can see how these two trajectories from the West, whether it's Enlightenment rationalist philosophy or Hebrew and Christian scriptures, and from the East, for example, Buddhism, but we could do the same thing with Jainism, Hinduism, etc. These come together. There was a recent book put out by Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama. The title is simply Joy. And it's about how you have joy, and it's these two persons involved in basically human rights, coming together and having conversations about joy. So we see this trajectory. And obviously where this is all going, and it certainly fits with this seminary and what we're attempting to do in inculcating you in the Jewish Christian tradition, is to train us in universal love and compassion for the other, considered universally. Right? There are no exceptions to this love. And so here's my question. Can we even do this? this is what's being required or asked of us. Can we even do it? Are we as Homo sapiens even capable of this universal compassion, this unconditional regard for the other, the great commandment and its universal love of neighbor, including the stranger and the foreigner? Can we even do it? Are we capable of Martin Buber's I-thou relationships with all things? With God, with our fellow humans, with the creatures of the natural world? Because here's the problem. According to the latest research in evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology, we cannot do this. We are not even built physically, neurologically, psychologically, socially, to be capable of doing this. Forms of empathy are possible. That is true, as these scientists will say. But not a universal form of empathy. Forms of empathy, yes. Universal form, no. It is an idealism, thus, that however lofty it may be, cannot be achieved, according to these research scientists. Which suggests that perhaps, to say this to the President of the Dean, perhaps we are wasting your time teaching you this ethic and the scriptures and traditions behind it. Questions?
Are you open for questions?
No, I'm not. More likely I'd get pilloried. So, for example, Jared Diamond, in his recent book, The World Until Yesterday, What We Can Learn from Traditional Societies, 2012, he brings up this question that we ourselves have been asking this semester in this course. What do we do about the Syrian refugees? Because supposedly we're to have humanistic and Christian and Jewish compassion on these fellow human beings in the name of humanism and of humanity. Because they're human. They're like us. They have needs and sorrows and dreams like us, and we would want the same treatment. So, therefore, we should let the other cross into our territory. We should accept refugees. Here's what Jared Diamond finds. Jared Diamond has spent his life with the indigenous tribes of the highlands of Papua New Guinea. Okay? That's where he spent his career. He's also spent time with other indigenous peoples, for example, the Kung in Africa and some tribes in the Amazonian basin. Here's what he finds is the pattern. That every culture has some term called barbarian. It seems to be how our brains are made to think. Us and them. Us and the other, who's not us, or foreigners, barbarians, others. This is how we think. And frequently, those who are called the other, not us, it's really questionable whether they're even human. Frequently in the languages, the only human people are us. They're subhuman or something other than human. For example, in Papua New Guinea, the other, or a stranger, simply means enemy. There is no nuance or other possibility here. Right? For example, well, the other is a potential person in trade, or a potential collaborator in joint goals, or someone we don't know but we could get to know. These other possibilities, they're not even in the language and conceptual ability of these tribes, of which there are hundreds or thousands of tribes with hundreds and thousands of different languages. So, the other means enemy. And he tells this very interesting story. He says that when a Papua New Guinean runs into, somehow encounters somebody they don't know, obviously somebody from a different tribe, they do one of two things. They either run away or they try and kill the person. And that's it. There's no 3 or 4, there's just the two. Run away or you try to kill them. Now, occasionally, he says, actually, you will sit down and talk to them. So he tells these stories, which came from the Papua New Guineans. He says, sometimes if you run across somebody on a trail, and you don't know them, they're not from your tribe, right? And frequently, they speak a different language. So you have to figure out how to communicate. But what will happen is these two people will sit down and talk to each other. And the conversation, this will be familiar to us from cocktail parties or from when we go to AARSPL or something like that. The conversation goes like this. Do you know X? Well, no, I don't know X. Are you related to Y? Is this your cousin once removed? No. They'll go through this. They will spend hours going back and forth. Well, what about this person? How about that person? Right? Hours. What they're looking for is a yes. Yes, I do know that person. They're, this person related to our tribe. And then all of a sudden, you have a link. Because, of course, there can be some intermarriage that goes on between tribes next to you. So, or what you want to find out is this person's a relative in some way. Once you have that, smiles break out, everybody relaxes, and then have a friendly conversation and figure out some collateral trade. Right? If you go through hours of this exercise and only get no's, the two people stand up and try and kill each other. So, certainly, the other in this case is not someone toward whom you have ethical obligations. Certainly not the ethical obligation to love them. And what Jared Diamond says is, this is who human beings are. This is who we were for millions of years. This is how we're built. Now, another social scientist. He is what's called a moral psychologist. Jonathan Haidt. He's professor of psychology at the University of Virginia. And he's written a fabulous book on happiness. But his more recent book is called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, 2012. I really think it's passé and not relevant today. We have such unanimity in this country. But what he does is he explains in this book why we are not capable of a universal ethic of love, and that it is unreasonable to expect such an actualization of that love in history. Okay. Now, it's a great book. Let me just give you a few of the highlights. Let me give you three. Number one, he says human beings are 90% chimpanzee. Okay, so in terms of our DNA and our and those of you who don't like Charles Darwin, so of our DNA and our lineage, we're 90% chimp. That's our closest relative. Okay, and what that means by saying 90% chimp is that chimps are basically selfish, right? So this should remind you of Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, from several decades ago. Chimps are selfish. They try and maximize their self-interest so that they can pass on their DNA. Right? And 90% of what we do is what the chimps do, which means we're trying to maximize our self-interest and pass on our DNA. So we're innately selfish. Okay? Now, what's interesting is what enabled the humans to break out of what essentially would be very small family groups out into the savannah and eventually up to Europe and Asia. What enabled this possibility? Well, you needed larger groups of humans who could work together. In other words, you needed something beyond a clan. You needed a tribe. You needed bigger groups of 200 or more. What enabled this to occur, the transition, the switch, which actually involved a change in our neurology, was gossip. Humans relied on a tool they discovered called gossip. Because the fact is that the traditional chimp way for the alpha chimp to hold people in line, which is basically to beat them up or kill them, is only effective with small groups. Right? When you get 200 or more, you can't beat up and kill everybody. So you need another method of basically of holding people in line and ensuring that there are no freeloaders. Because the problem is the freeloader. Somebody who wants to join the group, eat all the food, get the protection, but not do anything. Right? That decreases effectiveness of the group and group morale. So you need a method to check the freeloader. And what they discovered was gossip. You speak ill of the freeloader amongst your friends. Now, in order to gossip, you need language. So Jonathan Haidt's theory about the development of language was not that it's related to, we want to become Plato's rational being, and we want to think discursively and dispassionately about the nature of the world and figure out the start. No. He basically says, you need language if you're going to use that tool of gossip. Okay? So we developed, and language, his theory is what developed our prefrontal cortex, basically the latest version of the human brain, which is excellent at language. So, and this occurred relatively late in the stream of things, probably in the last 1,000,000 years. We're developing the prefrontal cortex. So, now, what does this mean, gossip? What it means about human beings is that what we're concerned about is our reputation for being cooperative and generous. We are not concerned about the actuality of us being generous and cooperative. You see the difference? In other words, I care about what others in the group perceive and think of me, regardless of whether I actually am now. I don't need to be generous and loving and cooperative. I just need you to believe I am, because then you'll accept me, you won't gossip about me, and you won't shun me and kick me out of the group. Okay, so humans are concerned for reputation and not its actuality. Well, you can see that even that piece of Haidt's theory undercuts these universal ethics. Because the ethic of universal love actually means you love these people and would do things to bring about their goodwill. Okay, so that's gem number 1 from Jonathan Haidt. Gem number 2 is he says this: human beings are a composite. You remember how I said that the prefrontal cortex is late in the game, right? Well, what's early in the game? The amygdala, right? The reptilian brain. That's been around for 500 million years, okay? And the reptilian brain has 500 million years worth of helping us survive, and it does so by quickly using the senses to perceive the nature of something approaching us and immediately determine whether we're going to walk towards it or walk away, okay? Because your survival depends on that. So in other words, if you see, there's some nice fresh fruit, I'm going to go eat that, okay? Versus there's a lion, I'm going to turn and run, okay? That's your amygdala, right? That's your reptilian brain. It happens in 1/10 of a second. 1/10 of a second, you're already deciding forward or back, okay? Now, your prefrontal cortex takes 2 seconds to come online. So, a tenth of 1 second and 2 seconds. What that means is you're already moving this way or that way before this comes online. Okay? Which is your reasoning center. How to figure out what to do and what's the best ethics, right? Okay. Now, what this means for Jonathan Haidt is that our reasoning is like a rider on top of an elephant. The elephant is the rest of us, the rest of our brain, our chemicals, our neurology. It's basically this intuition. And the reasoning part is up on top like a rider of an elephant. And, if you've ever ridden an elephant, it's hard to control the elephant. And so here's the theory, that our reasoning is not actually meant to figure out what's the ethical option in this situation, and let me see if I can find one that's a categorical imperative, and I'm interested in something universal, or no. That's not what our reasoning was developed to do. Rather, the rider on the elephant is more like our inner lawyer, okay? Or our inner press secretary. So all of us have a little Sean Spicer in our brains, okay? And so in other words, what we do is we've already made our decision. This is how it relates to politics and religion. We've already made all those big decisions in a tenth of a second. Then 2 seconds later, our brain comes online and says, how do I justify that decision I've already made to myself and to others? Right? Because you remember, you want to justify it because you want to convince them you're a good person. You have a good reputation. Okay? So, what this means, 90% chimp, we're a rider on top of an elephant. It means we are capable, despite the selfishness, we're capable of forms of altruism. But what we're capable of, first of all, is what Dawkins talked about and others, reciprocal altruism. Okay? In other words, for hate, when you're part of a group, you remember you're trying to figure out who the freeloaders are. And so what you do is, but you're basically selfish yourself. So what you do is you're willing to take a risk and make a sacrifice for the group. But you'll only do it a few times. And then you'll watch and see what other people do. And if you perceive that they also do that, they reciprocate, you'll keep the pattern. So you're willing to do that arrangement. And it's basically, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, right? Quid pro quo. I will be altruistic, generous, if everyone else will be. We are capable of that. All right. Now, the third gem that our friend Jonathan Haidt gives is this. Even though we're 90% chimp, we are 10% bee, honeybee. Okay? He prefers that term instead of the alternates. He could have said we're 10% termite, or we're 10% mole rat. These are the other few species in the world that are groupish or hive-ish, right, by nature. They have huge colonies, and everybody else will die for the sake of the hive, right? 10% of us is that. Now, what that means is there must be some kind of a switch, someplace in the brain, a hive switch, that when triggered, switches us from being selfish chimp to self-giving bee for the group. And he explains in the book what the triggers are, etc. But what happens is that this enables us to work with others in the group, to sacrifice ourselves for the group, to be self-giving, and it binds us to the others in the group. It also blinds us, here's a problem, for Buber's eye thou, it blinds us to the arguments and needs of the other groups. Right? In other words, we're able to see the needs and rationalizations for our group. But when somebody from another group comes up and says, hey, we got needs, let me explain it to you, we, for the life of us, can't understand what they're saying. We're blind to their arguments, but we understand our own. Like, this pulls in things like confirmation bias and that kind of thing. All right, so in our 10% B, groupish nature, we are capable of love once again, but it is what Haidt calls altruism. Parochial altruism. In other words, we're willing to be altruistic for our own, for those in our group, for us, not for them. So the conclusion, if you follow his thick book, is that the other or the stranger is left out of human love. It's simply not in the mix of what we're built and capable of doing. So that brings us to a quandary, because I started with the New Testament and with Reformed systematic theologians, And we have this universal love ethic, and yet Jonathan Haidt says it's pie in the sky, idealism, romanticism. It will never happen. We're not even capable. It brings up this question. Did Jesus himself even live this ethic of universal love? Of universal altruism, not reciprocal or parochial, but universal altruism. Did he live this out? I-thou relationships like Martin Luther claimed Jesus did, which he did. Buber in his book thinks Jesus is one of the best examples of someone who lived out I-thou encounters. Bart Migliore certainly confirmed that. Did he live it? Did he promote this ethic to others? Well, there are some scholars of the historical Jesus who say, no, he neither lived it nor promoted it. Okay? One such scholar is a figure named Reza Aslan. Currently, he has his own show on religion on the web, CNN or something. It's pretty good. But he's known for writing the book The Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, 213. So Jesus did not live this ethic. Contrary to our usual view of Jesus, Jesus was not nonviolent. So, it is true that there is no evidence that Jesus himself ever acted violently. So Aslan admits this. And there's no evidence that he ever incited violence directly. However, Jesus' message clearly was about the imminent advent of the coming kingdom of God. And Jesus almost assuredly saw himself as the Messiah who would usher in that kingdom. And these terms, kingdom of God and Messiah, were all interpreted by most, if not all, in the first century of Judaism as implying some type of Jewish military force led by God that would militarily and politically challenge, fight, and overrun the Roman army in Israel. As Jesus was one who made these statements about the kingdom of God and the Messiah, Jesus knew the coming kingdom would necessitate a war, and thus that his disciples would be involved in violence. The man was not pacifistic. Okay? Let me give an example of what Reza Aslan says. This is from pages 120 to 123 of his book, The Zealot. He believes the kingdom of God is a call to revolution, as Jesus is proclaiming it. But not just Jesus. There were other Messiah figures in first century Palestine who made the same kinds of claims as did Jesus. So, if the kingdom of God is not an ethereal fantasy, then it can only be established on a land occupied by Rome and through the use of force. So, the bandits or revolutionaries and messiahs of Jesus' day all knew this, which is why they didn't hesitate to employ violence in trying to establish God's rule on earth. And so Aslan's claim is that Jesus was one of these figures. Now, did Jesus agree with the bandits and messiahs that violence was necessary to bring about the rule of God on earth? Did he follow this zealot doctrine that the land had to be forcibly cleansed of all foreign elements, just as God had demanded in the scriptures? Here's what Aslan finds. The view that Jesus was an apolitical preacher with no interest in political turbulence in the world is false. So the image we have sometimes of Jesus is that he's an inveterate peacemaker. Love your enemies, turn the other cheek. And Aslan says that is a complete fabrication. There's no evidence, as we saw, that Jesus himself advocated violence. But if you look at Matthew 10:34, Jesus says, I have not come to bring peace, but the sword. Right? Now, it's only after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE that the Christians started fabricating or creating a pacifist, non-violent Jesus, the one who will not threaten Rome with violence. Now, was he a teacher of abstract ethical principles that all people should abide? Right? In other words, the author and embodiment of the universal love ethic. Aslan says no. Jesus was interested in Israel, in Jews, period. So, when he said, love your neighbor as yourself, he meant, no, love your fellow Jews. Foreigners and occupiers, the Torah said, according to Exodus 23, you shall drive them out. Make no covenant with them. They shall not live in your land. And God is a, quote, man of war, Exodus 15, who commands wholesale slaughter of all foreigners in the land, Isaiah 63. This is the only God Jesus knew and worshipped. So, Jesus had no more expansive view of his neighbors and enemies than did any other Jew of that day. You treat fellow Jews kindly, but you don't treat foreigners that way. And further, Jesus did not give a call to nonviolence or non-resistance. Okay, so Jesus understood, for example, in Matthew 11:12, that God's sovereignty could not be established except through the use of force. So, if Aslan is correct, then that explains a connection between historical Jesus and what we just saw in Jonathan Haidt. Right? We're not capable of universal love and altruism. But maybe these two we are capable of. That's a problem for me, because I do teach the universal love. I'm a Reformed systematic theologian and a Christian. And this is what I believe. I believe all that stuff I said, that the heart of God, the hallmark of God is love. And that between the three persons of the Trinity is love, gracious love. So this is a problem. So I'm wondering, can we say anything definitive or even likely about the communal ethics of Jesus from Nazareth? What can we say? Right? Well, there are two scholars, as well as the Jesus Seminary. A couple of scholars, John Dominique Crossan in his book God and Empire, Jesus Against Rome, Then and Now. And Marcus Borg, Jesus, Uncovering the Life, Teachings, and Relevance of a Religious Revolutionary. These scholars, plus those in the Jesus Seminar, like Robert Funk and others, what they claim is that Jesus never gave speeches that are contained in the Gospels. So you know how when you're reading the Gospels, particularly if you got one of those prized red letter edition books, right? What happens is you'll come across these long sections where it's all red. It's all Jesus words. What Crossan and Borg and New Testament historical Jesus scholars say, the Jesus Seminar, is they say, Jesus did not talk like that. Rather, he was more like a wandering cynic or sage, basically a teacher of alternative wisdom, as Borg says. And what he gave was one-liners, or what we might call Japanese koans, little prods to make people think, or short parables, right? Not the long ones. No, the little ones, yep. So, those are the things like, for example, he who would save his life must lose it, period. The audience is thinking, scratching, what did you just say? And he wants to leave them that way. Okay? So, the problem is, of course, as Albert Schweitzer said and might say today, is this Jesus that Crossan and Borg and the Jesus Seminar folk come up with, is this Jesus anything more than simply the Jesus they want to have? Right? In other words, they wanted, because the Jesus they come up with is nonviolent. And he does have universal ethics. Particularly Borg has Jesus with a universal ethic of compassion, not all that different than the Buddha. And so Schweitzer might say, maybe this universal compassionate Jesus is simply the projection of what Borg and Crossan want Jesus to be, because that's their ethic. That's the one that they want to promote. So we've got a problem. We're trying to find something definitive or maybe just likely about Jesus' ethic, about communal relationships. And it's not clear we can rely on Borg and Crossan because they don't think Jesus gave us any ethical statements, any ethical speeches. All we've got is one-liners that the gospel writers and editors cobbled together into groups. Okay? Classic examples, these long statements of teachings. Okay. However, There are two sources of historical Jesus, scholars that I believe are more credible, certainly than Aslan, but also Crossan and Borg. Both are also current New Testament scholars who focus on historical Jesus. These two scholars, one is a German named Jens Schroeder, and his book is Jesus of Nazareth, Jew from Galilee and Savior of the World, 2014. These are recent books. These are the most latest, up-to-date historical Jesus scholarship. The other one is by a man named Dale Allison, who used to teach at Pittsburgh Presbyterian Seminary and now is at Princeton. Constructing Jesus, Memory, Imagination, and History, from 2010. These books suggest something different about whether we can know Jesus' ethical positions or not. What I'm going to do is go through these two books, the sections that talk about Jesus' communal ethic. And we'll see what these two scholars tell us about Jesus in universal love. Jens Schroeder. I'm going to pick this argument up from pages 79 and following in this book I mentioned. This is where he compares Jesus with John the Baptist. Okay? And because some scholars claim that, like Crossan, for example, and Borg, that John the Baptist was a very different figure than Jesus, and that Jesus went in a very different direction than John the Baptist. However, Schroeder and Allison disagree. They say, no, Jesus is in coherence with John the Baptist, who was probably Jesus' teacher and mentor. So, both of them give a call for repentance, which is constitutive for the person's future deliverance. So, they share this idea of repent and believe because the kingdom is coming. They also both believe in a judgment which is going to occur by this God who is coming. The judgment completes the establishment of the reign of God on earth. Okay, now what's different about Jesus is that Jesus adds that the reign of God is already dawning now. John still said it's coming. Jesus says, no, actually it's now. And it's for Jesus, it's coming in and through his own activity and his own words. Okay? So in other words, for Schroeder, Jesus thinks that Satan has already been defeated. He pulls this text in Luke, I don't know if you're familiar with it, where Jesus exalts. He's exultant and he says, I have seen Satan fall like lightning from the heavens. Has anyone ever heard that text? I've seen Satan fall like lightning, right? Probably if you're Pentecostal, you've heard it. But us Presbyterians don't preach on it much. So, seeing Satan fall like lightning. And Schroeder says this is probably a mystical experience Jesus had, where he actually saw and discerned that God had defeated Satan in heaven. Which for Jesus meant, well, then it's coming to earth. And Satan, though he seems to rule earth right now, his days are numbered. And so Jesus sees his activity as he's the representative of God on earth, or of God's kingdom on earth, which is why his casting out of demons and his healing is so important. It is Jesus pushing the extent of that victory over Satan into this physical current world. Now, who are the ones that matter most to Jesus in this work? The poor, the hungry, those who mourn, day laborers, including Gentiles he meets, and those for whom God has special care. Right? So you get the sense already in Schroeder that Jesus sees those on the margins of society as especially important to God. Okay? So, Jesus is an itinerant preacher who goes everywhere in order to reconstitute the people of Israel and God's presence therein. Now, if you want to escape that judgment that's going to come at the end of this long process of God, if you want to escape a negative judgment. How do you do it? John the Baptist said you do it through an immersion baptism. Remember? Jesus disconnected the baptism from repentance, and then he said the way you escape the judgment is by joining the new fellowship, the new koinonia that I'm establishing. Okay? So one participates in it by joining this new community. There's only two necessities for the community. You have faith in the God of Israel, and you have faith that Jesus is God's representative of this inbreaking kingdom. Okay? So this is how Jesus perceives his ministry. It's a bit different than John's. Then notice what he's going about doing. He's casting out demons. He's healing people. But he also engages the Jewish purity system. He has a different understanding of purity and impurity. He keeps the categories. But instead of a purely defensive act against impurity, in other words, it's negative and exclusivistic. You say, we're pure, keep out the impure, right? America's safe, keep out those Syrian refugees. Right? In contrast, Schroeder says Jesus had a purity that was offensive. So instead of defense, you had an offense in relationship to purity. In other words, his purity, when he went out into other groups, spread like a contagion and made the impure pure. So it's an inclusive understanding of your purity that seeks to include others and bring them into the fold. Quite a different version, and you can see just from that one piece where Schroeder is going. This is going to be a Jesus of that universal ethic of love. Okay, so he's healing, he's casting out demons, he's spreading his own purity and God's purity. Okay? This, like most New Testament books or theology books, it's a big book, so I apologize. He teaches with authority. Schroeder says, it's great about Schroeder. Some New Testament scholars, like Borg or Cross, and they say, eventually people got tired of Jesus. They found him offensive, right? Particularly when he headed towards Jerusalem and he kicked over the coins in the temple. Then their attitude changed about it. Schroeder says, actually, Jesus was irritating from the very first day. Right? The entire ministry of Jesus that begins in Nazareth is one long, you're a pain, and we don't like you. Right? And the reason why he was a pain is because he said the reign of God is beginning. I have the authority and its representative. It requires absolute commitment, right? And you either see me as the authority of God or you don't, but there's no middle ground. And most people found that offensive. So, here's our picture of Jesus. Now, he's going out, healing, casting out demons, and spreading his purity like a contagion to those who are on the outskirts. He's also teaching, according to Schroeder. And Schroeder thinks, no, I think we can figure out his message. The genius of Schroeder is this. He thinks that Jesus had different instructions for two different groups. Okay? We all assume there's just the teaching of Jesus. And let's figure it out, and it's for everybody. Apparently not. There's basically a teaching of Jesus for his disciples who are going to follow him and do what he does. And then there's an ethical code for the reconstituted Israel, basically the people of God, who aren't going to leave their day jobs and families and follow him. Okay, so we got these two groups. That helps explain some of the more radical statements by Jesus, where most of us, including everyone in their day, would have scratched their heads and said, really? Because this is too extreme. You got to be kidding me. Okay? Those ethical exhortations were for this limited group of people. Basically, the 12 disciples and the other disciples, men and women, who left everything to follow him and do what he's doing. Okay. There's another ethic, which is for everyone. Everyone he's talking to in Israel. Okay. Now, let me Let me give you the highlights of these two ethical systems. Okay? All right, this is for the core, the disciples who are going to bring in the kingdom. He tells them to sever family ties. Right? Give up their possessions. Right? You're familiar with these exhortations, right? To have an uncompromising priority for the reign of God, right? The treasure, the pearl in the field. Okay? Or the pearl and the treasure in the field. So there's a totality to the claim of God on you. And see, what happens is Jesus is calling this core group to basically go out into the world and become a physical show place or showpiece of what that kingdom's going to be like. In other words, before it's fully here, you go out and try and live it and show everybody what it looks like. Right? But if you're going to do it now, when the world isn't this way, people are not going to like you. They're going to persecute you. Okay? So, Jesus says, don't worry, because your Father knows what you need. What that means is, you're going out without money or weapons to tell this irritating message I've been telling. They won't like you any more than me. And you're going to get pushback. Don't worry. Okay? Love your enemies. Once again, no, love your enemies because you're going to go get them when you preach my irritating message. Renounce retaliation. Do to others as you want them to do. There's a fundamental one-sidedness to these claims. You go and do these non-violent sacrificial behaviors with others, but they're not going to do the same for you. But I want you to do this. To show the order of violence and counter-violence that is the world. In other words, by doing this, you're demonstrating the world is full of violence and counter-violence forever. You also show the absurdity of that order of violence and counter-violence by intensifying it. Now, one way to get your head around what that looks like is when Martin Luther King Jr. tells his group, hey, we're going to march on Selma this day, and here's what's going to happen. Right? You're walking across that bridge, and Bull Connor, or whatever his name is, gets out the fire hydrants of the dogs. Okay? So that's what Schroeder is imagining Jesus do, is we're to show symbolically that the order of God stands opposed to the current order of violence, right? And so the enemy is going to be moved if they approach and gain this alternative way of life. So the goal is actually to save the enemy. You are to have mercy, and you're to show the perfect righteousness of God, and you're to form a bond, a community in which the unity is based not on hierarchy, but in equality, mutuality, and reciprocity. Right? Foot washing is our ethic. Okay, that's for the disciples and Mary Magdalene and the other disciples who are basically out doing Jesus' task in the world. Okay, right. And you can see universal love ethic. There it is, right there. Jesus telling them to do it. But if it's only for a small group, that actually goes with the Jonathan hate. So let's see what do we find when we look at the other group, which is everybody, right? All the Jews. Here's the ethic given to the people of Galilee and Judea. Okay? You can be part of the kingdom of God if you do the will of God. Then you're his family. Right? Notice how God offers this mercy to and grace to sinners. Right, now what is the will of God? Love. Not qualified. What else? Love and forgiveness. Those are the foundation. Love and forgiveness, the foundation of the fellowship. Now, why should you do this? Because God forgives you in this manner, so you should love and forgive one another. Okay? What else is there? Mercy. What else? Grace. What else? Openness and authenticity, right? So basically hates hypocritical chimp is in trouble. You are to include for this behavior sinners, tax collectors, and prostitutes. You're to have fellowship meals. You should not attach yourself to possessions, right? And so you should follow state authority unless it conflicts with worshiping God. Okay? In other words, Jesus did not see this ethic as charging people to openly rebel against the Roman Empire. But he's telling them these are the ethics of the kingdom of God that is already present in heaven. And it's coming now, and it's coming through my activity. Okay. All right, so that's Schroeder. What we have, without doubt, is a universal love ethic. It has a different extremity depending on he's talking to a particular group of people and saying, today, in this time and place, you got to leave your families, you got to leave your possessions and jobs, and you got to do what I do, and they're going to beat you up. Okay? But the universal ethic is still the same thing. Love, mercy, forgiveness. Okay? All right. Now there's a second New Testament scholar, Dale Allison, whose position on Jesus basically coheres with what we just heard about Jens Schroeder. Okay? So, in response, for example, to Crossan and Borg, who say that John the Baptist, with his apocalyptic vision and the coming judgment of God, is completely different than Jesus. Right? For example, Crossan is known for saying, yeah, I think Jesus studied with John the Baptist, and he probably did have John's views originally. But Jesus changed his mind. That's why he left John, and he went in a new direction. Okay? Instead, Allison says, no. Jesus submitted to John's baptism, which means he signed on to John's ethical vision. So there's never any repudiation by Jesus of John's vision. Now, what is included in John's vision and thus Jesus' vision? What is this talk about the kingdom of God that's coming? First of all, it's territorial for Allison. As for Schroeder, it's a place. It's land. Okay? Second of all, God is going to rule over that territory as a king. Third, the result or goal is God's rule, not just here, but throughout the world. Okay? And who are God's people? God's people are going to be gathered from the diaspora and worship God on Zion. Okay. So, that's the vision. Now, are there differences between Jesus and John? Yes. But they tend to be the same things that Schroeder discovered. Jesus focused on God's offer of salvation now to sinners. Jesus thought of himself as a representative of God bringing in the kingdom now. Jesus didn't think he needed to be baptized in water to repent and join this community. And Jesus was a glutton and a drunkard. So those are the differences Allison notices. All right. Here's the key piece, though. And I'm pulling here from chapter 4 of Allison's book. More than an aphorist, the discourses of Jesus. Okay, so Crossan, Borg, Robert Funk, they say Jesus, the historical Jesus, not the gospel guy, because he gets filled in. The actual guy was a sage who had few words. Okay? He has these aphorisms and parables that don't lend themselves to long speeches, right? If you have a long speech about your aphorism, you ruin it. It's almost like Jesus tweeted his way through Galilee and Judea. But Funk says Jesus probably did not collect his sayings into extended discourses, such as what we find in the Sermon on the Mount. He had brief parables and memorable one-liners. And what happened is Matthew gathers these things and puts them together. And he makes the Sermon on the Mount. Okay. All right. Here's Dale Allison's response. They're wrong. Jesus gave speeches. And occasionally, Allison will even say, Jesus gave sermons. Okay? He had connected discourses that were basically lectures. So, why did he probably have these? He's teaching in the synagogue. You got to compose a short homily if you're teaching in the synagogue. He also addresses crowds in the open. And people did not come together only to be accosted by a cryptic sentence or two, followed by Jesus' immediate departure. Right? And some portions of the Gospels contain those speeches. So we can get back to the historical Jesus and those speeches. Now, in this chapter, Dale Allison brings up the best candidate for a historical speech by Jesus. It is what is called the Sermon on the Plain. It is the Lucan version of the Sermon on the Mount. Okay? So the Sermon on the Plain. What Allison says is, if you look at this text, which we're going to look at, it's an organic unity. In other words, the pieces don't make sense if you scatter and disconnect them in time and place. They only make sense if they come together or not at all. And because they follow one upon the other. So clearly, this is probably a homily. Not that Jana or any of us ever do this. You don't give your sermons twice, but apparently Jesus might have. So he's repeating this homily that he had. Now, the Sermon on the Plain is actually, and by the way, he refers to Q, a textual source named Q, which is behind Matthew and Luke. But we're going to use Luke. Luke 6, 17 to 49 is Luke's gospel version of the Sermon on the Plain. Now, however, Allison admits not all this stuff is probably Jesus' original speech. Some of it is little sayings from elsewhere that the editor shoved into this speech. Okay, so for example, Luke 6, verses 20 to 26, the blessings and curses, that little list of blessings and woes probably circulated on its own originally. Or Luke 6:39, the story about the blind leading the blind, probably the authors, not Jesus. Luke 6:40, a student is not above his teacher. Clearly an academician put that one in there. So there are these texts that probably are additions. However, Luke 6:27 to 42. This is a piece. Jesus gave it. Okay? Now, what do we find here? This is Jesus' clear speech, according to a historical Jesus scholar. What does it tell us about how we should ethically behave? Okay? What you get is, first of all, an unconventional ethic by Jesus. He's not merely repeating what everybody knew and said. It's counter to common practice. It's even counter to common sense. Right? Because what it entails is you need to live outside your own skin. You need to live outside yourself, or what we could call with empathy. And the golden rule is a universal law. As you want to be treated, so you should treat all others. And there's this mutuality of embrace with even those who are unlike yourself. Okay? Let me show you how this works in the text. And then we'll have time for questions. Okay. Luke, if you turn to Luke 6, verse 27, here's what you find. Love your enemies. There's basically two topics in this. Love your enemies, judging others. Okay. Here's how the logic flows. But I tell you who hear me, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone strikes you on the cheek, turn to him the other also. If someone takes your cloak, do not stop him from taking your tunic. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what doesn't belong to you, do not demand it back. Okay? So, do to others as you would have them do. There's verse 31, golden rule. Now, why should you do this? If you love others, or if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. In other words, reciprocal altruism or parochial altruism. Now, if you do good to those, no, sinners do that. If you lend to those for whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love them without expecting to get anything back. Hate said that's dangerous. Then your reward will be great, for you will be sons of the Most High. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. So the ethical logic here is, you should do this because that's what God is like, and that's how God treats you. Okay? Then somebody's going to say, well, what does that really look like? To love these people who are not me. Jesus elaborates. Do not judge. So apparently it has to do with judgment. Think about hate and gossip. Gossip is all about judging. Right? Don't judge. You will not be judged. Don't condemn. You won't be condemned. Forgive. You will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Right? A good measure, pressed down. For the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Right? And then verse 41 and following, once again, the logic. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own? Right? You hypocrite. First, take the plank out of your eye, then you'll see clearly for your neighbor. Okay? Right? Basically, you remember Jonathan Haidt? He says that the 90% chimp with the press, right, with Sean Spicer in his head, complete hypocrite. Right? The best people who get their DNA passed on are the best hypocrites. And Jesus says, no. Okay? Why? Because of how God treats us. Okay? So, what happens? Why might this be a speech? Because there are parallels to this speech in the ancient world, both in Jewish texts but also in secular texts. Also, Paul repeats this basic speech. But here's a piece that's interesting. We could go more into detail on this, but let me just hit this highlight and then open it up for questions. The question is, who's my neighbor? Right? This is Jesus is engaging with Leviticus 19, the holiness code. Everyone in the audience knows it. They spend a lot of time talking about it because they're trying to figure out. So this is Jesus weighing in. So who is my neighbor? Some of the common answers in first century Palestine. Fellow Jews, fellow Israelites. No, that's my neighbor. Well, maybe we could add in foreign and resident aliens. Well, no. You should love your friend who is like to yourself, but you don't need to love those outside your group. These are all being debated as options. Then somebody says, what about wrongdoers? Well, they're debating that one. Then somebody says, oh no, we should do every human being. They're debating that one. Jesus weighs in and says this, love your enemies. And in terms of the rhetoric and ethical logic, it basically says all the above. Everybody gets loved. Because logically, if you're willing to love your enemy, then you're willing to love everybody else too. Because your enemy is the hardest person to love. Right? So Jesus is taking this ethic and making it universal. Jesus encouraged unrestricted benefaction and reciprocity. He discouraged revenge and judging others. And that was his ethic. Okay? So now we come back to the question, which I would love to expand on too, but we don't have time. The question is, well, what do we do? Are we even capable of doing this? Jonathan Haidt said no. One of his friends and colleagues, he admits he likes this guy, is a guy named Steven Pinker. He's also a psychologist. He's at Harvard. He wrote the book in 2011, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. His theory, another big book, his theory is that if you use empirical data and studies, not just your own gut or intuition or feeling or anecdotes, but you go to measurable statistics and facts, all the data show that violence has decreased throughout history, including the modern day, and we are at the least violent point in human history. And he measures all these things. And then the question he has is, how did that happen? Because he's not stupid. He knows all the same stuff hate knows. He knows the chimp and the bee and all of that. But he says, no, it's changed. And the reason is because in our makeup, which Jonathan Haidt also knows, is there's also a capacity for empathy. It's built in to the Homo sapien. What happens is it's possible to train yourself to expand the circle of empathy. The way that you do it is to train yourself something that's not innate or natural. It's to train yourself to see the world from the eyes of another person. To step outside yourself and say, I wonder what the experience in the world is from that person's point of view. And he says that's exactly what has happened in Western history and world history. It explains why progress has been made in reducing violence and being more inclusive in terms of our ethical approach, including things like animal rights. All of that is because of this expansion of the circle of empathy. He has fascinating reasons for why this gets expansive. One of them, this is provocative. He says the advent of publication and the novel. We think of novels as frivolous, but in fact, he says the novel enabled people to, with relative ease, to enter the world of another and to imagine their world. Right? So, the fact is, according to Pinker, not only can we do this, we are doing it. And so, yes, it's possible, and Jonathan Haidt is wrong. Thank you. Questions?
So in my country, actually, so I was a little bit shocked about the premise that you introduced, because in my country we have 7,641 islands, and we didn't really hegemonize until we were hegemonized by the colonialists, the Spanish.
Right.
As before that, the diversity made us all ungovernable by any foreign entity that came. And in fact, even when the Spanish came, they didn't really get all of the islands.
Yes.
So there's a lot of, what I see is the colonialists were coming from a sense of scarcity, and we were living in a sense of abundance, that it enabled us to actually get foreigners, radical hospitality, welcome. We welcomed 500,000 Vietnamese from the Vietnam War, thousands of Jews from the Holocaust. This is part of Philippine history. And they have become prosperous and not just settled in our country. So we don't even have a word for privacy in English. So, in Tagalog.
Yeah.
So I am just thinking that maybe the question is not will love win, but how do we let love win? Which is to come and create that abundance so that we can actually be more radically hospitable.
No, you're correct, and that's what Pinker does. Is he explains how can we make this happen? Basically, the universal love ethic. One of the ones he does mention is prosperity. Prosperity opens up possibilities that scarcity, or basically you're worried about your own survival, doesn't.
I don't know if I agree with Pink about violence that it reduces, because what I think is the introduction of nuclear weapons cause more people not to be violent, because they realize now that there is more powerful weapons than what they used to use. So that one brought down violence than really saying reduce, because now the government is controlling the market instead of when we didn't have any government violence, because I'm fighting towards my own good.
Right. He mentions this too. He gets people disagreeing with him all the time, although I think this guy thrives on it. But because basically people say, what about? And then they normally start with World War I and march on through 20th century history up till today. But what he says is, oh no, I know all about that. Those figures are factored into the statistics. The statistics still show a decline in violence. And so Anyway, he does talk about it in the book.
I guess I'm clarifying what you're saying about hate. He says universal altruism isn't going to happen
Correct.
because we're only capable of the reciprocal
And the parochial. Correct.
And I guess I'm looking at that and I feel like that breaks down when parochial says we're going to love our group. And I feel like folks like Jesus, Buddha are expanding that group to make that universal. So that's where the appeal is. So I guess looking at that, it would be possible provided that our group just gets larger.
Yes, and so that argument is Pinker's explanation for what the historical data show. So you're arguing Steven Pinker's view. What Haidt himself does is he says, you know, the best you're going to get is some healthy groups. And he doesn't talk about expanding one group or a group. He just says, we need healthy groups that don't see violence as the best way to get along with other groups. That's the best we can hope for. So he's basically arguing for group diversity, where everyone uses their writer, their head, to say, you know what, it's a little bit like when you get economic theories that say, you know what, if we trade, we're going to be better off, so let's stop trying to kill each other. It's a little bit, that's basically what Haidt says. So obviously Haidt and Pinker are coming from a different angle.
I want to go back to the 8 and the relationship with growth spiritually.
Yep.
Just get your take on spiritual growth, because Jesus says we should grow past him. We should grow spiritually past him. And there's a term homo spiritus instead of homo sapiens that some people of our time have used, and I really like that term, us growing. But if you're looking at brain and shifting our spiritual knowledge, I'd just love your take on who's doing that work and where are they going with it.
The ones who are doing it are the, again, scientists who are studying the brain and neurology and how spiritual practices affect the brain. There have been a lot of recent studies on that. And what they say is the brain can change and develop even as you do spiritual practices. There was a book that came out a bit ago called The God Spot. It actually found a portion in the brain that is related to mystical visions, prayer, right? And so the implication there is that portion of the brain developed through evolution must have done so for a purpose. So yes, it's possible to look into this via science. Haidt himself is more cynical. He basically says spirit, spirituality, universal love ethic. You know what? I can't chart that when I do my scientific studies. Let's just look at biology and evolution and psychology.
Yeah, that study keeps going with the dietary changes in from what I've studied. So dietary changes in evolution on what people ate made them more spiritual beings.
Yeah, and that's possible. Right. One more question.
Lord.
Mm-hmm.
So I've read studies about in-group love and out-group hate.
Uh-huh.
And the majority of people who want to do only in-group love, they don't want to actively do violence against their out-group people. They want policies and practices that advantage their in-group. They don't actually, there's a small number of people who actually want to kill their out-groups. And it even aligns with sort of the reptilian brain that just wants to run away. Doesn't actually want to kill your enemy, but just wants to run away, know to run away. So I'm just thinking the violent is those who want to do violence, something happens to them, or they're wired differently. Because most people, even though they only want to do in-group love, don't actually want to do physical harm to their out-groups. They just don't want them to have anything. They don't want them to be punished in any way.
Yeah, so what you're saying and what you study coheres with the Jonathan Haidt in two ways. First of all, he does talk about people who are violent because something's wrong with their brain, or they've had an accident to a portion of their brain that is related to that. So obviously psychopaths sociopaths, these kinds of people. They're violent because the brain isn't working correctly. However, what he also says is that the main impetus for that 10% B, or the hive switch, is not, I want to go kill the other. It's, I want to put my arms around my teammates and make a great project happen. It's, the football huddle. It's that kind of it's actually pleasant, cooperative, supportive. That's where the energy goes, is building up the group for a good project. It's not by necessity angry or violent at the other, but they're connected for Jonathan 8. Thank you so much.
Thank you.